Close your eyes for just a moment. Take a deep breath. Let the weight of today's worries slip away. In this space, there are no deadlines, no notifications demanding your attention, no rush. There is only time, vast, unhurried time, and a story that has waited centuries to be fully understood. As you settle in, imagine the world before concrete and steel, before the hum of engines and the glow of screens. Picture a land where the rhythm of life moved with the seasons, where every sunrise brought purpose and every sunset brought gratitude. This is not just a history lesson. This is a journey into the soul of a way of life that thrived for thousands of years across this continent. Let yourself be transported. Let yourself feel. And most importantly, let yourself learn what it truly meant to walk this earth as a Native American man, to be a son, a warrior, a provider, a spiritual being, and a guardian of ancient wisdom. Are you ready? Then let us begin, not at the beginning, but at a moment that captures everything. Part 1, the awakening. The first thing he felt was cold. Not the biting, cruel cold that speaks of death, but the clean, sharp cold of early autumn dawn that reminds you that you are alive. Tall Elk opened his eyes to darkness, the warm darkness inside the buffalo hide lodge where his family slept. His father's steady breathing came from across the fire pit, now reduced to glowing embers. His mother and younger sister were silent bundles beneath fur blankets. His older brother had left 3 moons ago on a vision quest and had not yet returned. Tall Elk was 14 winters old, and this was the day everything would change. He rose silently, as he had been taught since he could walk. Every movement in a Lakota lodge was deliberate, respectful of those who slept, mindful of the sacred space where family gathered. He pulled on his buckskin leggings, still slightly damp from yesterday's river crossing, and wrapped himself in the wolf-skin cloak his grandfather had given him on his last birthday. The wolf had come to his grandfather in a dream, offering itself as protection for the grandson who would one day lead. But leadership seemed impossibly distant to Tall Elk as he ducked through the lodge entrance into the pre-dawn darkness. Today, he had to prove he could even survive. The camp was beginning to stir. Smoke rose from a handful of lodges, where early risers prepared the morning meal. Dogs, half-wild creatures that served as sentries and companions, lifted their heads to watch him pass, then settled back into sleep. In the distance, the horse herd shifted and snorted, guarded by young men who would soon be relieved of their duty. Tall Elk walked to the edge of camp where the prairie opened like an ocean of grass, now silver with frost. Elder Broken Lance sat there, as he always did, watching the east. The old warrior's face was a map of his 70 winters, each scar, each line telling a story of survival, of battles fought, of wisdom earned through pain and observation. You could not sleep, Broken Lance said without turning. It was not a question. No, grandfather. Fear keeps sleep away. But fear also keeps a man alive. The elder finally looked at him, and his eyes, though clouded with age, saw everything. Your father went on his first hunt when he was your age. He brought back nothing, but he learned everything. Do you understand the difference? Tall Elk nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure he did. Success is meat in the belly, Broken Lance continued. Wisdom is knowing the ways of the elk, understanding the language of the wind, reading the stories written in tracks and broken grass. Today, you will go out as a boy playing at hunting. You will return as a man who understands what hunting truly means. Part 2. The Education of a Hunter. A Native American boy's education began the moment he could observe. Long before Tall Elk held his first bow, he had watched. He had watched his father and uncles prepare for hunts, listening to their strategies discussed in the Council of Men. He had watched his mother and aunts process every part of the animals brought back, nothing wasted, everything honored. He had watched the seasons change and learned to read the signs that spoke of migration patterns, weather shifts, and the secret language of the natural world. At age 5, he received his first bow. It was small, child-sized, but crafted with the same care as any adult weapon. His father had made it himself, choosing the ash wood carefully, bending it slowly over controlled fire, stringing it with sinew from a deer his family had taken the previous winter. The arrows were short, tipped not with the precious iron points traded from the east, but with fire-hardened wood and sharp bone. His targets were not living creatures, not yet. He shot at bundles of grass, at marks scratched into trees, at patterns drawn in the dirt. His father would move these targets farther and farther away, higher and higher, in different lights and weather conditions. "The arrow does not care about your intention," his father would say. "The arrow only knows the skill in your arm and the truth in your eye." By age 7, Tall Elk was allowed to hunt small game, rabbits, prairie dogs, birds. These hunts taught patience. A rabbit could sense the slightest disturbance, the smallest error in approach. Tall Elk learned to move like water, to breathe like wind, to become part of the landscape rather than an intruder upon it. He learned that rushing led to hunger, that frustration led to mistakes, that the best hunters were those who could become absolutely still, waiting for the moment when the world aligned. His grandfather taught him to read tracks. "This is not just a hoof print," Broken Lance would say, pointing to a mark in the mud. "This is a story. See how deep it presses? This elk is heavy, probably a bull. See how the edges are sharp? He passed recently, perhaps in the last hour. See how the prints move? He is not running, not fleeing. He is feeding, moving slowly from grass to grass. He does not know we are here. He has not caught our scent. Every track told a story. The stride length spoke of speed and urgency. The depth revealed weight and health. The direction indicated destination and purpose. Broken Lance could look at a trail and know if the animal was male or female, young or old, injured or strong, alone or with a group. This was not magic. This was observation refined over decades into an art form that kept people alive. By age 10, Tall Elk had killed his first deer. It was a young doe separated from her group by misfortune and his patient stalking. When his arrow struck true, he felt not triumph, but a strange mixture of pride and sorrow. His father had prepared him for this moment. "You must thank her," his father had said. "You must acknowledge her sacrifice. She is giving her life so that your family may live. This is not a small thing. This is everything." Tall Elk had knelt beside the dying doe, placed his hand on her warm flank, and spoken the words his father taught him. "Sister dear, I thank you for your life. I will not waste your gift. Your meat will feed my family. Your hide will keep us warm. Your bones will become tools that serve us. Your spirit will be honored in our stories. Walk the spirit path in peace and know that you are remembered." The doe's dark eye looked at him, and then the light went out of it, and Tall Elk understood in that moment the weight of being a provider. It was not glory. It was responsibility. It was the knowledge that other lives depended on your skill, your patience, your ability to take life so that life could continue. Part 3. The world before dawn on this morning of his first buffalo hunt. Tall Elk made his way to the sweat lodge at the camp's edge. This was not the large ceremonial lodge used for important rituals, but a smaller structure where hunters purified themselves before significant ventures. Several men were already there, his father, Standing Bear, his uncles, Swift Arrow and Runs Far, and 3 other experienced hunters who would lead today's hunt. The sweat lodge was a dome of bent willow branches covered with layers of buffalo hide. At its center was a pit where stones, heated in a fire outside, would be brought in to create steam. The entrance faced east, toward the rising sun, toward new beginnings. They entered one by one, crawling through the low opening, settling around the central pit in the darkness. The lodge keeper, an elder named Singing Crow, brought in the first stone using a forked stick. It glowed red-orange, radiating heat into the small space. He brought more stones, 7 in total, arranging them carefully. Then he closed the entrance flap, and they were sealed in complete darkness. Singing Crow poured water over the stones. The hiss was immediate, violent, and then the heat came, a wall of steam that made breathing itself an act of will. In the darkness, Singing Crow began to pray. "Tunkashila, Grandfather Spirit, we come before you with humble hearts. We ask for your guidance in the hunt today. We ask that you speak to the buffalo, Tell them that we come with respect, that we take only what we need to survive the coming winter. We ask for safety for these hunters, for skill in their hands and wisdom in their hearts. We ask that our families be fed, that our children grow strong, that our people continue to walk this earth in balance with all our relations. Each man added his own prayer, speaking into the darkness and the heat. When it was Tall Elk's turn, his voice cracked. Whether from emotion or the scorching air, he couldn't tell. I ask for courage. I ask for skill. I ask that I do not dishonor my father or my people. I ask that I learn what I need to learn today, whatever that may be. The heat intensified with each round of stones. Sweat poured from every surface of skin. The air itself seemed to burn. This was intentional, a purification not just of body, but of spirit. In this heat, pretense melted away. Pride evaporated. You were reduced to your essential self, stripped of everything but your core being. When you emerged, you were clean, ready to face whatever the world demanded. After the 4 rounds, 4 being a sacred number representing the 4 directions, the 4 seasons, the 4 stages of life, they emerged into the pre-dawn air. The cold felt like a blessing, like being born anew. They walked to the river and plunged into the cold water, gasping but cleansed, ready. Back at his family's lodge, Tall Elk's mother, Bright Wing, had prepared food. Not a large meal, hunters did not eat heavily before a hunt, but enough. Pemmican, the concentrated mixture of dried meat, fat, and berries that could sustain a man for days. Fresh water from the river. She said nothing as she served him, but her eyes held every emotion. Pride, fear, love, hope. His father checked his weapons. Tall Elk carried a bow his uncle had made for him on his 13th birthday. A man-sized bow now, requiring real strength to draw. He had a quiver of 20 arrows, each one he had made himself under his father's guidance. The shafts were straight. Ash, the fletching from hawk feathers, carefully split and attached with sinew and pine pitch. The points were a mix of stone and traded metal, each one sharpened to a razor edge. He also carried a lance, though he prayed he wouldn't need it. A lance was for close work, dangerous work, the kind of work that happened when something went wrong. The lance shaft was strong wood, the point a long leaf-shaped blade that could punch through buffalo hide and find the vital organs beneath. At his belt hung a knife, a hatchet, and a coiled length of strong rope. These were the tools that made survival possible, the tools that every man carried, the tools that represented the difference between civilization and chaos. Part 4. The hunt begins. They rode out as the sun broke the horizon, 12 men on their best horses. These were not the pack animals or the everyday riding horses. These were buffalo runners, carefully selected, meticulously trained horses that could race alongside a stampeding buffalo, that could change direction with the slightest knee pressure, that wouldn't panic when thousands of pounds of angry beast came close enough to touch. Tall Elk rode a paint horse named Windchaser, a gift from his uncle. The horse was 9 years old, experienced in the hunt, and had saved his uncle's life more than once by swerving away from danger without needing to be told. "Trust him," his uncle had said. "He knows the buffalo better than you do." They rode in silence through the awakening prairie. The grass was shoulder-high in places, still green despite the approaching fall. Wildflowers dotted the landscape, purple coneflowers, yellow sunflowers, the white stars of yarrow. Birds erupted from the grass as they passed, and once they startled a small herd of pronghorn that bounded away with impossible grace. The hunt leader was a man called Red Thunder, a hunter of legendary skill who had seen 40 winters and never returned from a hunt empty-handed. He rode at the front, reading the land with the same care that others read faces. He was looking for signs, tracks, droppings, disturbed grass, the flights of birds that might indicate a large herd moving nearby. After 2 hours of riding, Red Thunder raised his hand, and they all stopped. He dismounted, walked ahead, knelt down. When he returned, His face showed satisfaction. A large herd, maybe 300 animals, passed through here last night. The tracks are fresh enough that they haven't moved far. The wind is in our favor, blowing toward us, which means they can't smell us. We'll leave the horses here with 2 guards and approach on foot to scout. Then we'll plan our attack. Being a guard meant missing the hunt, and Tall Elk's heart sank, thinking he might be chosen. But Red Thunder selected 2 older men, experienced hunters who had made many kills and could sacrifice this hunt for the greater good. Your eyes are better than ours, Red Thunder told them. Watch for crow scouts. Watch for Pawnee. Watch for anything that moves wrong. We'll be back before the sun reaches its peak. The remaining 10 men moved forward on foot, crouching low, using the terrain's natural contours for cover. They moved single file, each man stepping exactly where the man ahead had stepped, leaving minimal trail. The wind was steady from the north, cool and carrying the scent of distant rain. After a mile, Red Thunder dropped flat to the ground, and the others did the same. Ahead, the land rose in a gentle swell. Red Thunder crawled forward, and Tall Elk's father crawled beside him. After several long moments, they crawled back, both men's faces tight with controlled excitement. Just beyond the rise, Red Thunder whispered. A herd of at least 400. Bulls, cows, calves. They're feeding, relaxed. The best scenario we could hope for. He scratched a map in the dirt with his finger. The herd is in a shallow valley, tall grass on all sides, but there's a clear area in the center where they're concentrated. We'll split into 2 groups, 5 men on the east side, 5 on the west. We crawl into position, wait for my signal, I'll whistle like a hawk. Then we stand, let them see us, and drive them south toward the river. The riverbank is steep there. They'll have to slow down, bunch up. That's where we take them. He looked at each man in turn. Choose your targets carefully. Cows and young bulls only, no calves, no old bulls unless absolutely necessary. We want animals in their prime with good meat and usable hides. Each man takes 1 animal. If everyone succeeds, that's 10 buffalo. That's more meat than we can process in 3 days. If you're tempted to take a second shot, remember that every arrow costs time to make, and every wounded animal that escapes is a waste of life. Make your first shot count. His eyes settled on Tall Elk. Young one, you'll stay with your father. Mirror his movements. If he shoots, you shoot. If he runs, you run. If he says retreat, you retreat without question. Understood? Yes, Hunt Leader. Your job today is not to prove you're a man. Your job is to learn how to become one. Clear? Yes, Hunt Leader. They split into 2 groups. Tall Elk went with his father, his uncle Swift Arrow, and 2 other hunters named Gray Wolf and Touches Clouds. They circled wide to the east, staying below the rise, moving with agonizing slowness. Every step was tested before weight was committed. Every movement was smooth, without sudden jerks that might catch a distant eye. It took nearly an hour to reach position. By the time they did, Tall Elk's muscles ached from the strange crouched walk, and his heart hammered so hard he was certain the buffalo could hear it. His father touched his shoulder, pointed. Through the tall grass, perhaps 200 yards away, Tall Elk saw them. Buffalo. Not 10 or 20, but hundreds. A sea of dark brown bodies, massive heads down as they grazed, calves playing at the edges, bulls standing sentinel at the perimeter. The sound of their breathing, their shuffling, their occasional low rumbles created a constant background noise that seemed to make the earth itself vibrate. Tall Elk had seen buffalo before, of course, but always from a distance, always safely from a ridge or through trees. Never like this. Never close enough to see the individual muscles rippling beneath the hide. Never close enough to see the birds perched on their backs eating insects. Never close enough to feel the sheer overwhelming presence of so much living mass concentrated in one place. His father leaned close, whispered directly into his ear. See the cow at the edge, the one with the torn ear? She's young, healthy, slightly separated from the main group. She's your target. When the herd runs, stay with her. Don't let other animals get between you and her. If you lose sight of her, Pick another target immediately. Don't waste time searching. Aim for the heart-lung area, just behind the front leg. The buffalo's skull is too thick for arrows. The spine is too small a target. The heart-lung is the size of a cooking pot. Hit there and she'll run 50 yards and fall. Miss, and she'll run 5 miles, and you'll have nothing but shame. Tall Elk found the cow with the torn ear. He memorized her position, her size, the exact shade of her coat. He would know her when they ran. The wait seemed endless. The sun climbed higher. Sweat ran down Tall Elk's back despite the cool air. His legs began to cramp from the awkward crouch. He wondered if something had gone wrong with the other group, if they should retreat, if the hawk whistle cut the air. As one, the 10 hunters stood from the tall grass. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The buffalo looked up confused. They had never learned to fear humans on foot. Humans were just another animal, no more threatening than deer or antelope. Then Red Thunder shouted, and all 10 men shouted with him, waving their arms, suddenly expanding from hidden threats to obvious danger. The buffalo's confusion lasted another heartbeat, and then ancient instinct took over. They ran. Part 5, the thunder of hooves. To say the buffalo ran is to say that a waterfall falls or that lightning strikes. It's factually true, but captures nothing of the reality. The buffalo didn't run. They became a force of nature, a living avalanche, a stampede that turned the world into nothing but noise and dust, and the earth-shaking impact of thousands of hooves striking ground in terror-driven flight. The hunters ran too, angling toward the river, trying to get ahead of the herd or at least parallel to it. Tall Elk ran beside his father, his eyes locked on the cow with the torn ear. She was in the middle of the pack, running strongly, her calf beside her, but starting to fall behind. They reached the horses. In one smooth motion, practiced 1,000 times, each hunter mounted, and suddenly they were in the chase, really in it. Wind Chaser stretching out into a full gallop that matched the buffalo stride for stride. The noise was beyond anything Tall Elk had imagined. The buffalo bellowed in fear and confusion. The calves bawled for mothers. The bulls roared warnings. The hooves created a thunder that drowned out thought itself. Dust rose in choking clouds, and through it all the hunters rode, becoming part of the stampede, indistinguishable from the buffalo in the chaos. Tall Elk's father pulled ahead, his more experienced horse finding gaps in the herd, moving closer to the interior where the prime animals ran. Tall Elk followed, trusting Wind Chaser to avoid the sudden turns, the unexpected stumbles. The places where one misstep would mean being trampled by the animals behind. The cow with the torn ear was ahead now, slightly to the right. Tall Elk urged Wind Chaser closer. The horse responded instantly, cutting right, threading between 2 bulls that gave way at the last moment. And suddenly they were there, running parallel to the torn ear cow. Close enough that Tall Elk could see the whites of her eyes, close enough to see the foam at her mouth, close enough to die if anything went wrong. He reached for an arrow. This was the hardest part, something he'd practiced but never done at full gallop with death inches away. He knocked the arrow, drew the bow, felt Wind Chaser steady beneath him, the horse knowing what was needed, providing the stable platform that made the impossible possible. The buffalo cow ran. Tall Elk aimed, not at where she was, but where she would be, leading the target, accounting for his movement and hers, for the bouncing of the horse and the wind and the dust and every variable that made this shot nearly impossible. His father's voice came back to him from 100 practice sessions. Don't think. Thinking makes you miss. Feel. Let your body know what your mind can't calculate. Trust your training. Release. Tall Elk released. The arrow flew. In the chaos of the stampede, he almost lost track of it, but he saw it strike, just behind the front leg, exactly where his father had told him to aim. The cow stumbled, but kept running. For a horrible moment, Tall Elk thought he'd made a bad shot, that she would run forever with his arrow in her side. But then she began to slow, falling behind the herd, her run becoming a trot, her trot becoming a walk, and finally she stopped, stood swaying for a moment and fell. Tall Elk pulled Wind Chaser to a stop, leaped down, ran to the fallen buffalo. She was still breathing, her eye rolling in fear and pain. He drew his knife, knelt beside her, and performed the killing stroke his father had taught him. Quick? Sure, ending her suffering as her life left. He placed his hand on her massive shoulder and spoke the words, "Sister Buffalo, I thank you for your life. I will honor your sacrifice. Your meat will feed my people through the winter. Your hide will become lodges and robes. Your bones will become tools. You will be remembered in our stories. Walk the spirit path in peace." Around him the stampede had passed, heading south toward the river. He could see other hunters with their kills, could see his father riding back toward him, could see the success written on every face. The hunt had worked. They had meat. They would survive another winter. His father dismounted, looked at Tall Elk's kill, examined the arrow placement, and nodded. Just that, a single nod. But in that nod was everything: pride, approval, recognition. You are no longer a child. You are a hunter. You are a man. Part 6. The work after the kill. The killing was the dramatic moment, the event that would be remembered and retold. But for a Native American hunter, the real work began after the animal fell. The processing of a buffalo was a monumental task that required knowledge, skill, and respect for the animal that had given its life. The two men who had guarded the horses rode back to camp to bring help. Processing 10 buffalo required the entire community. Within 2 hours, a procession of women, children, and elders arrived with travois, V-shaped frames that could be loaded with meat and dragged by horses. They brought tools, knives, scrapers, axes, rope, leather bags, and the woven baskets used for carrying organs. Tall Elk's mother came, and his sister, both armed with these specialized knives used for skinning and butchering. They approached the buffalo Tall Elk had killed, and his mother smiled at him with such pure joy that Tall Elk felt his chest tighten with emotion. "You did well, my son," she said quietly. "Now I will show you what comes next, because a hunter who cannot process his kill is only half a hunter. The first step was the hide. Buffalo hide was perhaps the most valuable resource on the plains. It became lodge covers that could house entire families. It became robes that could keep a person warm in the deepest winter. It became bags, rope, boats, shields, door covers, and 1,000 other essential items. A hide properly removed and processed could serve a family for years. Bright Wing showed him where to make the first cuts: around the legs, along the belly, around the neck. The cuts had to be shallow, careful not to damage the hide itself, but deep enough to separate it from the underlying tissue. She and 2 other women worked together, pulling the hide back as they cut, using the buffalo's own weight to help separate skin from flesh. It took nearly an hour to fully remove the hide. They spread it out, flesh side up, and began the first stage of cleaning, scraping away the fat and membrane that clung to it. This fat was not wasted. It was carefully scraped into containers where it would later be rendered and used for waterproofing, for cooking, for making pemmican, and for a dozen other purposes. Next came the meat. This required knowledge that took years to fully master. A buffalo had hundreds of pounds of meat, but not all meat was equal. The backstrap, the long muscles running along either side of the spine, was the most prized, tender, and flavorful. The hump meat was rich and fatty, perfect for winter survival. The legs held tough muscle that needed long cooking but provided substantial nutrition. The ribs, the brisket, the neck, the shoulders, each cut had its purpose, its ideal preparation, its place in the seasonal diet. Tall Elk's mother and the other women worked with practiced efficiency, cutting along natural muscle groups, separating cuts with precision that would have impressed any modern butcher. As each section was removed, it was placed on clean hides, separated by type, ready for transport back to camp. But the meat and hide were just the beginning. As his mother had taught him since childhood, the buffalo gives us everything we need. To waste any part is to disrespect the gift. The bones were carefully extracted and saved. Long bones would be cracked for their marrow, a rich source of fat and nutrients. Ribs would become sled runners for winter travel. Shoulder blades would become hoes for farming tribes. Smaller bones would be carved into needles, awls, and tools for working leather. The organs were handled with special care. The heart, liver, and kidneys were considered delicacies, often eaten fresh at the kill site in a celebratory meal. The stomach and intestines would be cleaned and used as containers for water and for cooking. The bladder would become a waterproof bag. Even the blood was collected to be used in soups and sausages. The hooves would be boiled down to make glue. The horns would become cups, spoons, and decorative items. The tail would become a fly whisk or ceremonial object. The sinew, the long tendons that ran along the back and legs, would be dried and separated into fibers, stronger than any thread, used to bind arrow points, stitch leather, and create bowstrings. Even the buffalo chips, the dried dung that littered the prairie wherever buffalo roamed, served a purpose. In a land often scarce of wood, buffalo chips burned hot and clean, providing fuel for cooking fires and heat through long winters. As Tall Elk watched his mother and the other women work, he understood that the hunt was not about dominance or conquest. It was about respect and partnership. The buffalo gave everything, and in return, his people gave gratitude, care, and the promise that nothing would be wasted. Part 7. The Return to Camp. They loaded the travois with meat, hides, and organs. The weight was enormous. A mature buffalo cow like the one Tall Elk had killed could yield 800 pounds of usable materials. The horses strained against the load, but these were strong animals bred and trained for exactly this work. The journey back to camp took most of the afternoon. They traveled slowly, both because of the heavy loads and because this was a procession of celebration. Songs were sung, songs thanking the buffalo, songs honoring the hunters, songs of gratitude to the spirits that allowed the hunt to succeed. Children ran ahead to announce the hunters' return. By the time the group reached camp, the entire village had gathered to greet them. Elders stood at the forefront, and it was to them that the hunters first presented themselves, offering portions of the fresh liver as a sign of respect and a recognition that the elders' wisdom and prayers had made the hunt possible. Tall Elk looked for his grandfather, Broken Lance. The old man stood near his lodge, leaning on his walking staff, his weathered face impassive. But when Tall Elk brought him a portion of the heart from the buffalo he had killed, the old warrior's eyes glistened with moisture. "You have become what I knew you would become," Broken Lance said quietly. "Your ancestors smile on you today. Your children's children will hear the story of your first buffalo. You are a provider now. The responsibility is great, but you have shown you can carry it." That night, the camp held a feast. Fires burned bright, and on spits above them, the fresh buffalo meat cooked, fat dripping and flaring in the flames. The smell was intoxicating, rich, savory, promising the survival that this meat represented. But before anyone ate, there was ceremony. Red Thunder, as hunt leader, stood before the largest fire and offered a prayer. "Grandfather Spirit, we thank you for this day. We thank the buffalo for their sacrifice. We thank the earth for sustaining the buffalo, the grass for feeding them, the water for giving them drink. We thank the wind for carrying our scent away from them. We thank our horses for their speed and courage. We thank the arrows that flew true and the hunters who shot them. We acknowledge that we live because others die, and we promise to honor that exchange by living with wisdom, by sharing what we have, and by teaching our children to respect all life." Only then did the feast begin. Meat was distributed according to tradition, first to the elders, then to the families with small children, then to the hunters themselves, and finally to everyone else. There was enough for all. In times of plenty, Native American communities shared without hesitation, knowing that in times of scarcity, others would share with them. Tall Elk ate beside his father, the meat tasting unlike anything he had eaten before. Perhaps it was the hunger from the long day. Perhaps it was the pride of having provided it himself. Or perhaps it was the understanding that this meat represented everything his people believed: cooperation, respect, skill, and the delicate balance between taking life and honoring it. As the evening progressed, the storytelling began. This was how history was preserved, how lessons were taught, how culture was transmitted from generation to generation. Stories of great hunts from years past. Stories of hunters who made extraordinary shots. Stories of mistakes and lessons learned. Stories of buffalo that seemed to have spirits of their own, choosing to sacrifice themselves for the benefit of the people. An elder named Plenty Horses told a story that made everyone listen closely. When I was young, younger than Tall Elk is now, I went on a hunt with my father and uncles. We found a herd, we made our approach, we began the chase. I selected a large bull, thinking that more meat was better. My father shouted for me to choose a cow instead, but I didn't listen. I was proud. I was foolish. I shot the bull. My arrow struck true, just where it should. But a bull's hide is thick, his body massive, his will to live enormous. He ran, and I followed and followed. 5 miles we went, and finally he fell, far from camp, far from help. By the time I returned with men to help process the meat, wolves had found it. We salvaged less than a third of what we should have had. I learned that day that hunting is not about proving yourself. It's about feeding your people. The most successful hunter is not the one who makes the most impressive kill. It's the one whose family never goes hungry. Everyone nodded at this wisdom. Eyes turned to Tall Elk, and he understood that Plenty Horses had told this story specifically for him, a reminder that today's success was just the beginning, not the culmination, of his journey as a hunter. Part 8. The Seasons of a Man's Life. To understand what life was like for a Native American man, one must understand that his identity was not fixed, but evolved through distinct stages, each with its own responsibilities, privileges, and challenges. The first stage, childhood, was a time of learning through observation and play. Boys played games that mimicked hunting and warfare, but these were not idle entertainments. They were training exercises. A game of seeing who could stay hidden longest in the tall grass taught camouflage skills that would later save lives. A contest of who could shoot arrows most accurately while running taught coordination that would be essential in the chaos of a buffalo hunt. Wrestling matches taught leverage, balance, and the ability to overcome larger opponents through technique rather than brute strength. But childhood was also a time of tenderness that white observers often found surprising. Native American fathers were typically very involved with their children, carrying infants on cradle boards while working, playing with toddlers in the evenings, telling stories to older children before sleep. Harsh physical punishment was rare. Children were taught through example, through stories, through natural consequences, rather than through violence. Tall Elk remembered his own childhood as a time of warmth and security. His father had taught him to ride before he could walk properly, placing him on a gentle mare and walking beside him for hours, building confidence and balance. His mother had taught him the names of plants and their uses, which were good for food, which for medicine, which to avoid. His grandfather had taught him patience through the ritual of tool making, showing him how to chip obsidian into arrow points, a process that could take days for a single perfect point and could not be rushed without ruining the stone. The second stage, youth, was the transition phase Tall Elk was now entering. This was when boys began to take on adult responsibilities while still benefiting from adult protection. A youth accompanied hunts, but was not expected to provide the primary kills. A youth learned warfare through mock battles and small raids, but was kept from the most dangerous fighting. A youth began to court girls, but was not yet ready for marriage and family. This was also the time of the vision quest, one of the most important rites of passage in many Native American cultures. Tall Elk's brother had left 3 moons ago for his vision quest, and had not returned, which was not unusual. A vision quest was not a weekend camping trip. It was a spiritual ordeal that could take weeks or even months. The vision quest typically involved going alone into the wilderness, often to a high place or an isolated location, bringing nothing but water and fasting while praying for guidance. The goal was to receive a vision, a dream or spiritual experience that would reveal the young man's path in life, his strengths, his weaknesses, his spirit animal or guardian, and his adult name. Not everyone received a clear vision immediately. Some men spent weeks in isolation, growing weak from hunger, their minds beginning to drift into altered states where the barrier between the physical and spiritual world thinned. In these states, animals might speak, ancestors might appear, or abstract symbols might convey meaning that would take years to fully understand. When a young man returned from a successful vision quest, he would meet with the tribal elders and a medicine man to interpret what he had experienced. This interpretation would guide major life decisions, which skills to focus on developing, which path to pursue, what his role in the community would be. Tall Elk wondered what vision his brother had received, whether he would return as a warrior or a healer, a hunter or a spiritual leader. Each path was honored, each necessary for the community's survival. The third stage, adulthood, was the longest and most complex. An adult man was expected to be many things simultaneously: a provider who could hunt or farm successfully, a warrior who could defend the community from threats, a craftsman who could make and maintain the tools necessary for survival, a diplomat who could negotiate with other tribes and, increasingly, with white settlers and soldiers, a spiritual participant who fulfilled his ceremonial obligations, and eventually a father and teacher who would raise the next generation. This was not a narrow specialization. A Native American man needed to be competent in dozens of skills. He needed to know how to track animals, how to read weather signs, how to navigate by stars, how to find water in drought conditions, how to treat injuries and illnesses with available plants, how to make fire in wet conditions, how to construct shelter from available materials, how to identify friend from foe at great distances, how to communicate across language barriers, and how to survive alone if necessary. And unlike the specialized labor of industrial societies, these skills could not be assumed to be available from others. A hunting party might be caught by a blizzard days from camp. A warrior might find himself alone and injured in enemy territory. A man might need to keep his family alive through a harsh winter when no help was coming. Self-sufficiency was not a luxury or an affectation, it was existential necessity. The fourth stage, elderhood, brought new responsibilities. An elder was no longer expected to hunt or fight in the first line, but his wisdom became his contribution. Elders served as advisors, mediators, teachers, and living libraries of knowledge. In a culture without writing, elders were the repositories of history, of medicinal knowledge, of spiritual practices, of diplomatic relationships with other tribes. Elders were cared for by the community, but they were not idle. Broken Lance could no longer chase buffalo, but he could teach young hunters to read tracks. He could advise on the best routes for seasonal migrations. He could remind the community of their values and traditions when conflicts arose. He could perform ceremonies that required deep knowledge of proper protocols. And perhaps most importantly, elders provided continuity. They had lived through good times and bad, had seen leaders rise and fall, had witnessed cycles of plenty and scarcity. Their perspective prevented the community from making rash decisions based on temporary circumstances. Part 9. The warrior's path. Not every man became a warrior in the formal sense, but every man was expected to be capable of defending his community when necessary. Warfare in Native American societies was complex, varied enormously by tribe and region, and often fundamentally different from European concepts of warfare. In many plains tribes like the Lakota, warfare served multiple purposes beyond simple conquest. Counting coup, touching an enemy without killing him, was often considered braver than killing from a distance. Stealing horses from enemy camps demonstrated skill and courage. Small raiding parties tested young warriors and kept traditional enemies off balance. Large-scale battles were relatively rare and often more ritualized than European warfare, with both sides withdrawing after a certain number of casualties rather than fighting to annihilation. This didn't mean Native American warfare was gentle or harmless. It was dangerous and men died, but the goals were often different. Territorial expansion wasn't always the objective. Many conflicts were about honor, about maintaining the respect of other tribes, about securing resources like hunting grounds or trade routes, or about avenging specific wrongs rather than about destroying entire peoples. Tall Elk's culture placed enormous value on bravery, but bravery was defined differently than simple willingness to fight. True bravery was protecting others at risk to yourself. It was maintaining your composure when terrified. It was making the difficult choice that served the community even when it cost you personally. He had heard stories of warriors who achieved legendary status not primarily through killing, but through acts of spectacular courage or cunning. One story told of a warrior named Standing Alone who, when his raiding party was surrounded by a much larger force, told his companions to flee while he held the enemy's attention. He fought alone against dozens, moving constantly, shooting arrows from different locations to make the enemy think there were more defenders. He gave his companions time to escape, and when he finally fell, the enemy found his body pierced with 23 arrows, but he had killed or wounded 14 of them. The enemy were so impressed by his courage that they didn't scalp him, but instead performed burial rites according to their own customs, an unusual honor for a fallen enemy. Another story told of a warrior named Clever Fox, who infiltrated an enemy camp alone, located where they kept their horse herd, and over 3 nights gradually moved the horses 1 or 2 at a time to a hidden canyon. By the time the enemy discovered what was happening, Clever Fox had stolen 40 horses without anyone seeing him once, without shedding any blood, achieving a victory that enriched his tribe and humiliated his enemies far more effectively than any battle could have. These stories taught young men that violence was not the highest value. Cunning, courage, and accomplishing objectives with minimal bloodshed were the markers of a truly skilled warrior. Training for warfare began young. Boys practiced with toy weapons, small bows, wooden knives, blunt-tipped spears. They played games of stealth, trying to sneak up on adults without being detected. They learned to endure discomfort, sleeping outside in cold weather, going without food for a day, running long distances without stopping. As they grew older, training became more serious. Mock battles between groups of youths taught tactics and teamwork. Learning to ride and shoot simultaneously took years to master. The ability to shoot accurately while at full gallop was what made Plains warriors such formidable opponents that European and American military forces struggled for decades to defeat them. Young warriors also learned the protocols of warfare, which tribes were current allies and which were enemies, what counted as legitimate provocation for war and what required peaceful negotiation, how to treat prisoners, which varied enormously by culture, what could be taken as legitimate spoils and what was considered dishonorable even in war. The relationship between tribes was complex. 2 tribes might be bitter enemies in one region, but allies in another against a common threat. Marriage between tribes could create peace that lasted generations. Trade relationships might persist even between groups that occasionally raided each other. And traditional enemies might unite rapidly when faced with a new threat, as many tribes learned when European diseases, settlers, and military forces began to fundamentally alter the balance of power across the continent. Part 10. The Spiritual Life. For a Native American man, the spiritual dimension of life was not separate from the practical dimension. Spirituality was woven into every action, every decision, every relationship. The division between sacred and secular that characterized European Christianity simply didn't exist in most Native American worldviews. Everything had spirit. The buffalo that gave its life had a spirit that needed to be honored. The river that provided water had a spirit that could be generous or stingy, depending on how it was treated. The mountains, the storms, the forests, the wind, all were alive in a sense that went beyond metaphor. They were conscious entities that could be communed with, negotiated with, offended, or honored. This worldview created an ethics of reciprocity. When you took from the earth, you gave back. Offerings were made before harvests. Prayers were spoken before hunts. Thanks were given after successful endeavors. The goal was balance, not taking more than needed, not wasting what was given, maintaining the relationships that allowed life to continue. Tall elk had participated in ceremonies since infancy. Some were large communal events, the sun dance that occurred in summer, lasting days and involving the entire tribe. Others were smaller, the sweat lodge ceremony before the hunt, private prayers at dawn, offerings left at sacred sites. Thus, Sundance was perhaps the most intense ceremony in Plains culture. It lasted several days and involved fasting, dancing, drumming, and for some participants, physical sacrifice. Men would have wooden skewers inserted through the skin of their chests or backs, attached to ropes tied to a central pole. They would dance, pulling against the ropes, sometimes for hours, until the skewers tore free. This was not sadism or primitive brutality. It was sacrifice, offering pain to the spirits in exchange for visions, for healing, for the welfare of the community. Those who participated in the sun dance described altered states of consciousness, visions of ancestors or spirit animals, moments of profound clarity about their path in life. The physical pain created a mental state where ordinary consciousness fell away and something deeper could emerge. Not everyone participated at this level. Observers came to pray, to support those who were sacrificing, to receive the benefits that the sacrifice generated for the entire community. Children watched and learned. Elders supervised, ensuring protocols were followed correctly. Other ceremonies marked life transitions. Naming ceremonies when a child received their name, coming-of-age ceremonies when a youth became an adult. Marriage ceremonies that united families and created alliances, funeral ceremonies that helped the deceased transition to the spirit world and helped the living cope with loss. Each ceremony had specific protocols that had been passed down for generations. Specific words had to be spoken. Specific actions had to be performed in the correct order. Specific offerings had to be made. These protocols weren't arbitrary. They were understood to be the language through which humans could communicate effectively with the spiritual realm. Medicine men and women served as specialists in this communication. They had deep knowledge of plants and their medicinal properties, but they were more than herbalists. They were spiritual intermediaries who could diagnose spiritual as well as physical ailments, who could perform rituals to ward off malevolent spirits or attract beneficial ones, who could interpret dreams and visions, who could predict weather and animal movements through spiritual means. The medicine man in Tall Elk's tribe was named Sees Far. He was a quiet man, younger than many elders, but old in terms of knowledge. He had received his calling during a near-death experience when he was 20, falling through ice into a freezing river and experiencing visions during the moments when he balanced between life and death. After he was rescued and revived, he found he could see things others couldn't. The spiritual causes of physical illnesses, the presence of spirits in locations and objects, the future consequences of present actions. Sees Far had spent years learning from older medicine men, memorizing the properties of hundreds of plants, learning the songs and prayers associated with different ceremonies, acquiring the tools and objects needed for his work. He owned a medicine bundle, a collection of sacred objects specific to his spiritual path that he guarded carefully and only opened during ceremonies. People came to Sees Far with all manner of problems. A woman whose child was sick, a man troubled by nightmares, a couple unable to conceive, a warrior who had lost his courage. Each situation required different treatment, sometimes herbal medicine, sometimes ritual cleansing, sometimes interpretation of spiritual messages, sometimes advice on how to restore balance in relationships or with the natural world. Tall Elk had gone to Sees Far when he was 12, troubled by dreams of being chased by a black wolf. Sees Far had listened carefully, asked many questions, then told Tall Elk that the wolf was not an enemy, but a messenger. The wolf represents a part of yourself you fear, Sees Far had explained, a fierce wild part that doesn't fit with how you think you should be. But the wolf's power is your power. Instead of running from it, you must learn to run with it. The wolf will become your ally if you accept it rather than fight it. That interpretation had changed Tall Elk's relationship with his dreams. When the black wolf appeared again, he stopped running. He faced it, and in the dream, the wolf sat down, tilted its head, and seemed to smile. After that, the dreams became less frightening and more instructive. Sometimes the wolf would lead him to places in the dream. Sometimes it would show him things, visions of hunts, of dangers, of paths he might take. Part 11. Relationships and Marriage. As Tall Elk moved through his youth toward full manhood, the question of marriage would eventually arise. In Native or American cultures, marriage was not primarily a romantic arrangement between two individuals. It was an alliance between families, a practical arrangement that created kinship networks, strengthened the tribe, and ensured the continuation of the people. This didn't mean romance didn't exist. Courtship rituals varied by tribe, but often involved young men demonstrating their worthiness to potential brides and their families. A young man might play a courting flute outside a girl's lodge, the haunting melody carrying his feelings without words. He might give gifts, a well-made pair of moccasins, a deer he had killed, beadwork or quill work showing his craftsmanship. He might perform brave deeds in warfare or hunting, building a reputation that would make him an attractive partner. But the girl's family had substantial say in whether a match would be permitted. They evaluated the young man's character, his skills as a provider, his family's reputation, his prospects for the future. A lazy man, or one known for poor judgment, might be rejected regardless of how much the girl liked him. A man from an enemy tribe would almost certainly be refused. A man whose family had a history of conflict with the girl's family would face serious obstacles. Some tribes practiced arranged marriages, particularly for first marriages or for matches that served important political purposes. A chief's daughter might be married to the son of a chief from another tribe to cement an alliance. A young man of high status might be matched with a girl from a prominent family to strengthen both lineages. But even in arranged marriages, compatibility was considered. Families tried to match personalities to create partnerships that had a chance of working, and in many tribes either party could refuse a match, though doing so might disappoint families and require careful negotiation to avoid offense. Once a marriage was agreed upon, there were ceremonies and exchanges. The groom's family typically gave gifts to the bride's family, horses, hides, weapons, food, demonstrating both wealth and generosity. This wasn't buying the bride. It was compensating her family for losing her labor and companionship, and it was a test of the groom's ability to provide. The bride's family would reciprocate with their own gifts, a lodge fully equipped with everything needed to start a household. Food stores, tools, and often a horse or two. The goal was to give the new couple the best possible start. The marriage ceremony itself varied enormously by tribe. Some involved elaborate multi-day celebrations with feasting, dancing, and ritual. Others were simple. The couple might simply move into a lodge together with family approval and be considered married. Some tribes had gift exchanges where the couple shared food, symbolizing their commitment to provide for each other. Others involved spiritual ceremonies led by medicine men or women, calling on spirits to bless the union. After marriage, a man's responsibilities expanded dramatically. He was now responsible not just for his own survival, but for his wife's welfare, and, soon enough, for children. This was when a man's hunting and gathering skills became truly critical. A successful hunter could provide well for his family, earning respect and status. A poor hunter might struggle, and his family might face hunger that other families did not. But marriage was partnership, not hierarchy. While men and women typically had different responsibilities, both were essential and both were valued. Men hunted, went to war, made weapons and tools, and handled negotiations with other tribes. Women gathered plants, processed hides, made clothing, raised children, maintained the household, and often had significant political influence through their own councils and through their influence on male relatives. In many tribes, women owned the lodges and household goods. If a marriage failed, the man left and the woman kept everything. In some tribes, descent was traced through the mother's line rather than the father's, giving women significant status. In others, women could become warriors or healers or hold other roles, typically associated with men if they showed aptitude and received appropriate visions or calling. Tall Elk had observed several marriages in his young life. His parents had a strong partnership. His father consulted his mother on major decisions. His mother's opinions were respected by the extended family. They worked together smoothly, each handling their responsibilities without constant conflict. But he had also seen marriages that struggled. A cousin had married a man from another band, and they fought constantly. She thought he was lazy. He thought she was too demanding. Eventually, she sent him away, keeping the lodge and their daughter, and everyone agreed it was for the best. Another family friend had lost his wife to illness when she was young. He had mourned for a year, as tradition required, and then married her younger sister, a practice that was acceptable and even encouraged in some situations because it kept the children connected to their mother's family and ensured the sister was provided for. Some men had multiple wives, though this was typically only men of high status who could afford to provide for multiple households. A chief might have 2 or 3 wives, often sisters, which strengthened the alliance with that family and ensured capable household management. But polygamy was not random. There were protocols about which relationships were acceptable, how wives were to be treated equally, and what responsibilities came with supporting multiple families. Part 12. Conflict and Diplomacy. Life as a Native American man was not lived in isolation. Tribes interacted constantly, sometimes peacefully, sometimes violently, often in ways that mixed cooperation and competition in complex patterns. Trade was a major form of interaction. Different tribes specialized in different resources based on their geography and culture. Plains tribes had buffalo products in abundance. Tribes near the coast had shells and ocean resources. Tribes in the southwest had turquoise and pottery. Tribes near obsidian deposits had the volcanic glass that made the sharpest tools. All of these goods moved along trade networks that spanned thousands of miles. Tall Elk's tribe traded regularly with several neighboring groups. In summer, when travel was easy, trading parties would visit allied tribes, bringing buffalo robes, pemmican, and horses to exchange for corn, beans, and squash from agricultural tribes, or for shells and copper from tribes with access to those resources. These trading expeditions were also diplomatic missions. Leaders would meet, share news, discuss threats, negotiate agreements about hunting territories or about cooperation against common enemies. A trading relationship could prevent war. The loss of a trading relationship could trigger conflict, but not all interactions were peaceful. Resource competition was real. When buffalo herds shifted territories, tribes that depended on them might follow, bringing them into conflict with tribes already in those areas. Water sources during droughts became points of serious tension. Insults between tribes, a killing that went unavenged, a broken agreement, a raiding party that crossed boundaries into sacred sites could trigger cycles of retaliation that lasted generations. Tall Elk's grandfather spoke often of the need to understand not just fighting, but also when not to fight. A young warrior thinks courage is always attacking, Broken Lance would say. An old warrior knows that sometimes the braver choice is to walk away from a fight you would win, because the cost of winning is too high. This wisdom had been tested when Tall Elk was 10. A raiding party from a rival tribe had stolen horses from their camp. The young warriors wanted immediate retaliation, but the tribal council, led by elders including Broken Lance, had argued for a different approach. They sent a delegation under a peace flag to the rival tribe's territory. The delegation consisted of 3 respected warriors and a medicine man. They brought gifts, tobacco, food, a finely made pipe. They requested a meeting with the rival tribe's leaders. When the meeting occurred, they did not make threats or demands. Instead, They reminded the rival leaders of the long history between the tribes, of marriages that had created kinship connections, of times they had traded peacefully. They acknowledged that both tribes faced bigger threats, white settlers pushing into their territories, soldiers building forts, diseases spreading. "We can spend our strength fighting each other," the delegation leader said, "and when we are weak, our real enemies will destroy us both. Or we can find a way to live as neighbors, not friends perhaps, but not enemies. We ask for the return of our horses, not as surrender, but as recognition that we are strong enough to take them back, but wise enough to ask instead." The rival tribes' leaders deliberated for 2 days. Finally, they agreed to return most of the horses and to establish a formal boundary that both tribes would respect. It wasn't perfect. Some horses were not returned. Some warriors on both sides grumbled that honor demanded blood, but it prevented a war that could have killed dozens and solved nothing. Tall Elk had learned from this that strength came in many forms. Physical courage was one, but diplomatic courage, standing before potential enemies and arguing for peace when your warriors wanted war, required a different kind of bravery. Part 13. The Changing World. But even as Tall Elk learned the traditional ways, he was growing up in a world that was changing with terrifying speed. White settlers were no longer distant rumors. They were building towns, forts, and railroads. They were killing buffalo not for meat, but for sport, leaving carcasses to rot. They were bringing diseases that swept through native camps like invisible fire, killing the old and the young with no regard for status or virtue. The tribes were divided on how to respond. Some advocated war, driving the settlers out before they became too numerous, destroying the railroads and forts, fighting for every inch of ancestral territory. Others advocated accommodation, signing treaties, accepting reservations, learning the white man's ways before those ways destroyed them entirely. Both approaches had failed repeatedly. Treaties were signed and then broken by white authorities when it suited them. Warriors won battles but lost wars against an enemy that could replace losses faster than they could inflict them. Reservations promised peace but delivered poverty, confinement, and cultural destruction. Tall Elk's father spoke of these things with deep worry. "When I was your age," Standing Bear said, "the buffalo were so numerous that the prairie turned black with them. Now there are places where they are gone entirely. The white hunters kill 100 in a day and take only the tongues, leaving the rest for scavengers. In 10 winters, maybe 20, there may be no buffalo at all. And if there are no buffalo, how do our people live?" This question haunted Tall Elk. Everything he was learning, how to hunt buffalo, how to process the hides, how to follow the herds, all of it depended on the buffalo existing. If they disappeared, what would his skills be worth? What would his people become? Some tribes were already adapting. They were learning farming more extensively, though it went against the grain for people who had been nomadic hunters for generations. They were learning to raise cattle, though the cattle were nothing like buffalo in terms of what they provided. They were learning English, learning to read and write, learning the white man's laws and politics in hopes of navigating the new world that was being forced upon them. But adaptation came at a cost. The more they adapted to white ways, the more their traditional culture faded. Languages were forgotten as children learned English in boarding schools. Ceremonies were banned or abandoned. Traditional governance structures were replaced with systems that mirrored white authority. Identity itself became uncertain. Were they still truly Lakota, or were they becoming something else, something neither fully native nor fully white? These questions had no easy answers. Tall Elk saw respected elders disagree vehemently about the right path. He saw families split between those who wanted to fight and those who wanted to adapt. He saw young men his age struggling to figure out who they were supposed to be in a world that seemed to have no place for the kind of man their fathers had raised them to become. Part 14. Daily Life and Routine. Despite the large changes happening around them, daily life continued with rhythms established over centuries. Understanding what life was like for a Native American man requires understanding these routines. the patterns that filled days and defined normalcy. Morning began before dawn for most men. The first task was often checking on the horses. Horses represented wealth, mobility, and security. They needed to be counted to ensure none had strayed or been stolen. They needed to be moved to fresh grazing if they had depleted the current area. Any that showed signs of injury or illness needed immediate attention. After the horses were secured came personal care. Men bathed regularly, often in cold rivers or streams, a practice that shocked white observers who themselves bathed rarely. Physical fitness was maintained through constant activity, but also through deliberate practice. Men might run distances to maintain endurance, practice with weapons to keep skills sharp, or engage in wrestling or other competitive sports that built strength and reflexes. Breakfast was often light, left over from the previous night's meal, or simple foods like pemmican that required no preparation. Heavy eating in the morning made activity difficult, and mornings were for work. The day's activities varied by season. In summer, much time was spent preparing for winter, hunting to build food stores, processing hides for winter clothing and lodge repairs, gathering plant materials for medicine and for winter meals, making and repairing tools that would be needed when weather made such work difficult. In fall, the pace intensified. This was prime hunting season when animals had fattened on summer growth. The buffalo hunts that would determine whether the tribe ate well or starved through winter happened in fall. Every able-bodied man participated in some capacity, whether as a hunter, a scout, a processor, or a guard. Winter brought a slowing of activity. When snows came and temperatures dropped, people stayed close to camp. Men spent winter days making and repairing tools, weapons, and clothing. They told stories, passing down history and wisdom. They participated in ceremonies and councils. They planned for spring, where to travel when snow melted, which tribes to visit for trade, what resources to seek. Spring meant movement. Winter camps broke up and tribes migrated to summer territories. Men scouted ahead to find the best routes, to locate water and game, to watch for threats. Once summer camps were established, attention turned to other tasks, raiding if relationships with neighboring tribes had soured over winter, trading if they remained friendly, hunting the different game that became available in spring. Throughout all seasons, tool-making was constant. Arrows were used and lost. Bowstrings weakened and broke. Knives dulled and needed resharpening or replacement. Clothing wore out from constant use. Lodges needed repairs. The work of maintaining the material culture that made survival possible never ended. But there was also leisure. Native American life was not unending toil. When work was done, there were games, foot races, arrow shooting contests, ball games, dice games, tests of strength and skill. There was music, drums, flutes, singing. There was art. Men created beautiful objects not just for function, but for aesthetic pleasure. Decorated weapons, carved pipes, painted shields, intricate beadwork on clothing. All of this represented time spent on beauty for its own sake. Social life was rich. Men gathered to talk, to share news and stories, to debate questions facing the tribe, to joke and laugh. Friendships between men were deep and lifelong. Bonds forged in shared danger and sustained through decades of mutual support. Part 15. Skills and Knowledge. The breadth of knowledge a Native American man was expected to possess was staggering. This was not a society where you could specialize narrowly and depend on others for everything else. Self-sufficiency and broad competence were survival necessities. Consider just the knowledge required for hunting. You needed to understand the behavior of dozens of different animals, their feeding patterns, their migration routes, their mating seasons, their responses to weather and time of day. You needed to know how to track each species, recognizing that deer tracks differed from elk, that a running animal left different signs than a walking one, that fresh tracks could be distinguished from old ones by subtle clues. You needed to understand weapons intimately, how to select wood for bows based on the grain and flexibility, how to bend the wood using heat and patience without cracking it, how to attach sinew backing to increase power, how to make bowstrings that wouldn't break under repeated stress. How to select feathers for arrows based on which birds provided the best flight characteristics. How to chip stone or work metal into points. How to attach those points securely so they wouldn't come loose in an animal. You needed to understand ballistics intuitively, the arc of an arrow at different distances, how wind affected trajectory, how to aim differently for uphill versus downhill shots, how to lead a moving target. All of this without mathematics or written charts, purely through practice and observation. You needed to understand field dressing, how to butcher an animal efficiently, which organs were safe to eat immediately, which needed careful preparation, how to preserve meat through drying or smoking, how to render fat, how to clean and process intestines for use as containers, and hunting was just one domain. Consider navigation. Native Americans regularly traveled hundreds of miles through unmarked wilderness and arrived exactly where they intended. They navigated by stars, by the sun's position, by wind patterns, by the types of plants that grew in different areas, by landforms that served as reference points. They could read a landscape and know where they were in relation to their destination, even if they had never been to that exact spot before. Or consider weather prediction. Native Americans could often predict weather days in advance by observing cloud formations, animal behavior, plant signs, and atmospheric conditions. This knowledge was not superstition, it was empirical observation refined over generations. When a medicine man said a storm was coming in 3 days, he was often right, not because of magic, but because he had learned to read the same signs that modern meteorology measures with instruments. Medical knowledge was extensive. Native Americans knew which plants could reduce fever, which could stop bleeding, which could ease pain, which could induce vomiting to clear poisons, which could treat infections. They knew how to set broken bones using splints. They knew how to stitch wounds using bone needles and sinew thread. They knew how to treat burns, snake bites, and numerous other injuries and illnesses using available resources, and then there was the knowledge that could not be easily categorized, the deep understanding of the natural world that came from spending every day immersed in it. Knowing that ravens often followed wolves because wolves led them to carcasses. Knowing that certain flowers blooming meant certain game animals would soon be moving to different territories. Knowing which trees indicated permanent water underground. Knowing how to predict when a river would flood based on snowpack in distant mountains. All of this knowledge was transmitted orally, through demonstration and practice, through stories and mnemonics. There were no textbooks, no reference manuals. If an elder died before passing on specific knowledge, that knowledge could be lost forever. This made teaching the next generation absolutely critical, and it made elders repositories of irreplaceable information. Part 16. Warfare and Combat. The reality of combat for a Native American warrior was far different from romanticized portrayals. It was terrifying, chaotic, and required split-second decisions that determined life or death. A raid might begin with days of travel, moving silently through enemy territory, sleeping without fires, eating only cold food, constantly alert for discovery. The goal might be to steal horses, to count coup, to avenge a previous attack, or to capture enemies. When the raid began, usually just before dawn, when alertness was lowest, everything happened fast. Suddenly you were running toward an enemy camp, trying to reach the horse herd before alarms were raised. Arrows might fly towards you in the darkness. You had to identify targets instantly, who was a warrior who might fight back versus who was a non-combatant who should be avoided. You had to control your horse while using weapons, while moving through unfamiliar terrain in darkness or twilight. If you reached the horses, you had to cut them loose and drive them away while enemies organized pursuit. Now you were riding flat out, pushing horses as hard as they could run, expecting arrows or gunfire from behind at any moment. You might ride for hours, changing direction frequently to throw off pursuit, splitting up and reuniting at prearranged locations to divide the enemy's attention. If you were caught, combat was brutal and personal. Bows at close range, hand-to-hand with knives, war clubs, and tomahawks, wrestling on the ground trying to gain any advantage. The dust, the noise, the smell of blood and sweat and fear. Friends dying beside you, enemies you were trying to kill just as they tried to kill you, and if you survived and returned home, you had to process what you had experienced. Some warriors gloried in combat, became famous for their skills and courage. Others were haunted, suffering what we might now recognize as post-traumatic stress. There were ceremonies to help warriors transition back to peaceful life, to ritually cleanse themselves of the violence they had participated in, to honor enemies they had killed and ask forgiveness for taking life. Tall Elk had not yet experienced combat. His father hoped he never would have to. War brings glory to young men who haven't seen it, Standing Bear said, and brings sorrow to old men who have. The stories make it sound noble. The reality is young men screaming as they die, families destroyed, hatred that lasts generations, and gains that rarely justify the costs. But Standing Bear also taught Tall Elk combat skills, because hoping war wouldn't come was different from being prepared if it did. Tall Elk practiced with weapons daily. He learned hand-to-hand combat from his uncles. He listened to warriors describe tactics and strategies. Because if the day came when he had to fight, being unprepared meant death, his own and possibly that of people he was supposed to protect. Part 17, Leadership and Governance, Leadership in Many Native. American societies was fundamentally different from European models. It was not hereditary in the sense that a chief's son automatically became chief. It was earned through demonstrated ability, wisdom, generosity, and the respect of the community. A young man who aspired to leadership had to prove himself in multiple domains. He needed to be a skilled hunter and warrior, demonstrating courage and competence. But he also needed to be generous, sharing his kills with those in need, giving away possessions to help others, placing community welfare above personal accumulation. He needed to speak well, articulating positions clearly and persuasively in council. He needed to show good judgment, making decisions that proved wise in hindsight. And he needed patience. Leadership usually came in middle age or later. After decades of building reputation, chiefs often had specific domains. A war chief led in times of conflict but might have limited authority during peacetime. A peace chief handled diplomacy, adjudicated disputes, and made decisions about camp movements and resource allocation. A ceremonial chief oversaw spiritual matters. These roles could overlap and in smaller tribes might be combined, but specialization was common in larger groups. Decisions were typically made through council rather than by decree. Important matters would be discussed by elders, by respected hunters and warriors, sometimes by women's councils, depending on the issue. Everyone had a chance to speak. The goal was consensus, finding a solution that everyone could accept, even if not everyone's first choice. This could make decision-making slow, frustrating those who wanted quick action. But it also meant that decisions, once made, had broad support. People were more willing to commit to a plan they had helped create than to one imposed from above. Tall Elk watched these council meetings, learning how leadership actually worked. He saw that the most respected speakers were not those who yelled loudest or claimed most certainty. They were those who listened carefully, who acknowledged other viewpoints, who found common ground, who asked good questions that helped others think more clearly. He saw his grandfather, Broken Lance, exercise influence despite holding no formal title. When Broken Lance spoke, others listened, because his words reflected 7 decades of experience and hard-won wisdom. He didn't speak often, but when he did, his opinions carried enormous weight. He also saw how leaders could lose respect. A chief who became arrogant, who stopped listening to others, who made decisions that benefited himself over the community, could find his authority eroding. People would simply stop following his lead. In extreme cases, a leader might be formally deposed, but more often, leadership would just drift to someone else as people chose to follow a different voice. Part 18. Work and craftsmanship. The creation of objects was not merely functional for Native American men. It was an art form, a meditation, and a connection to ancestral knowledge. Consider the making of a bow. Tall Elk's uncle Swift Arrow was renowned as a bowmaker, and watching him work was to witness the transformation of raw material into a tool that could mean the difference between eating and starving. It began with selecting the right wood, usually ash, but sometimes hickory, Osage orange, or other woods depending on what was available. Swift Arrow would spend weeks looking for the perfect tree, one with straight grain, no knots, the right thickness. He would pray before cutting, thanking the tree for its sacrifice, explaining that its wood would help feed families. Once cut, the wood had to be seasoned, dried slowly over months to remove moisture without cracking. Rush this and the bow would break in use. Swift Arrow stored bow staves in his lodge, turning them regularly, checking for warping, waiting with a patience that modern manufacturing made obsolete.